historian and a good one, and he writes about Roman history. He wrote a book called Christianizing the Roman Empire, and after he researched this subject, he makes this statement. He says, "Resurrection in the flesh appeared a startling, distasteful idea, at odds with everything that passed for wisdom among the educated." So only somebody of lower intelligence would believe. Well, and speaking of that, and Nicole, this is the exceptions to the rule here. So you get a sense of where we're going here, from Homer, Aeschylus, just the prevailing wisdom of the day. When Christianity brings forth resurrection onto the world scene, this is going to be quite a shock to people. This, if you were trying to invent a religion that people were going to follow, the last thing you would do is present the idea of resurrection. That's the last thing you would do, because nobody's going to buy into it. Now, the exceptions to the rule. Now, there are evidences of some people thought that you died, and there's even some of this in some of the ancient Greek stuff where, okay, you died and then you're a ghost, or what they call the shade, and you're hovering around your tombstone. Once in a while you might visit an ancestor. So there was that out there, but again, a lot of that is presented in mythology, in mythological texts, and everybody knew that. And so the idea of maybe taking this seriously, it's an exception to the rule, but I don't think a lot of people were buying into it. Now, there was also, if you study the ancient world, there's these things called mystery religions, of course, where little religions that had secret rites, and you were initiated into this rite, into this religion, through some ceremonies. That's why they're called mystery religions, because not everybody could access the religion. You had to be in the group and go through the rites. Well, there's some talk there about, okay, you live and then you die and then maybe you live on. Again, these were not widespread. They come off sounding more like, again, wishful thinking than certainly based in any fact or any historical event. And then you have the Egyptians, of course, who had a whole different view of life after death. And again, this is happening in Egypt, and it happened way prior. I mean, the age of the pyramids, for example, is around 2500 BC. So you're looking at hundreds and hundreds, even thousands of years before a lot of the Greek writings. The Egyptians were hoping, of course, for some sort of life after death with Osiris and Isis and all of the Egyptian gods. But that way of thinking pretty much dies out with the great Egyptian period of history. Now, there is one person, though, who's going to come along and really change not only ancient thinking, but Plato is going to also have a huge impact on the Christian faith. Plato is, of course, the great philosopher. He lived from 428 to 348 BCE. Plato comes up with something that is going to start having an effect upon the thinking about life after death in the ancient world. Okay, Plato said that you have a soul, that there's the real you is inside of you, and that the body is keeping the real you from flourishing. And he actually, on this chart, and I don't know, hopefully you can see that, but he actually breaks it down into three parts. Your soul has three parts. There's your intellect, your will, and then the desires that you have. And his argument is that, okay, when you die, the soul is going to live on and it's going to be great. You'll finally be released. You'll be free from your bondage to the body. And Plato, of course, very smart guy, and his argumentation in the ancient world was pretty solid, and people started to say, hey, yeah, I get what he's saying. I understand that there's that inner me. I understand that there's something inside of me that it just yearns for freedom. Freedom from the bondage of this body and this present world. And so Plato, his thinking starts to be adopted by, if not a majority of the ancient world, then certainly a significant amount. Certainly in Greece itself, the idea that the soul is good and the body is bad. Real liberation occurs at death, as the soul will live on in some disembodied existence. Now Plato, keep this in mind, Plato's had a huge influence on Christianity, and not necessarily for the good. Many Christians today would be surprised to learn that they hold a Platonic view, meaning Plato's view, a Platonic view of heaven, which is not biblical. Plato's view of life after death is not the vision and not what's recorded in the New Testament. That you and I are going to live some disembodied existence in some sort of mystical heaven, which we cannot identify or grasp. But you can trace this belief right back to Plato. And you'll see in future weeks that first couple of centuries after the resurrection, this is the argument in the church between a group called the Gnostics, who believe that the body is bad and the soul will live on. Gnostic Christians say, yeah, this is the resurrection. Whether Jesus actually was raised or not is immaterial, but what lives on is his spirit. Paul, of course, and the rest of the Orthodox Christian view says, no, this isn't what happens. Plato's wrong. We are going to have a bodily resurrection. It's going to be different. Our body is going to be different, but it is bodily resurrection. And after you die, you're going to go with the Lord, but then on resurrection day, you will be reunited. This is the argument that's going to take place between those who hold a Platonic view of resurrection or life after death and the sort of, for lack of a better term, I'll call it the Orthodox version of the New Testament. Plato's heaven is one in which humans are free from the imperfect physical material world. Plato believed that humans are primarily made up of a soul, and that soul is trapped in a body, much like being trapped in a prison. Now, I want to stop there for just a second. Anybody have any thoughts on this? I know I've hit you with quite a lot here. I'm looking out at a lot of you are just sitting there stunned. I don't know what you're thinking.
Well, I was thinking about
Laura.
that it's almost like he says, well, if the soul's trapped in the body, like a prison, well, if you weren't in your body, then think of how much more work you could do, because you wouldn't have to eat, sleep, you wouldn't get sick, things like that. But then how could you do the work?
There's a lot of ways to look at this. Yeah. Doris.
Sit here and think, they don't know any more than I did. Really, they've not experienced any heaven. It's just all subjective. It's right. It's subjection.
Yeah, it's all, they're thinking about it. Plato's thinking about it. The thing about the old Paul, and you'll see this next week, is Paul is going to link our resurrection, our belief in the resurrection of the body, to God's creative power. He links it right back with Genesis, and that Jesus is the new Adam. And that on Resurrection Day, you and I and all believers are going to receive a new body. It's going to be us. We're not going to be, there's going to be continuity. You're going to be you and I'm going to be me. But we are going to have a resurrected new creation body in the new heaven and new earth. That's going to be the position of not only the Old Testament, but then Paul, of course, and the New Testament writers. So keep this in mind. This is that tension between Plato and his powerful influence on the Western philosophy and Western civilization versus what is the New Testament saying. Any other thoughts? It's okay to speak.
Will the body be recognizable?
Absolutely.
That's not what Jesus said. He told the woman that had several husbands that there were no relationships in heaven. She's not recognizable.
How do you reconcile then the transfiguration?
Well, the transfiguration really has nothing to do with the resurrection.
Well, the fact that Abraham and Elijah are alive and they know who they were.
Well, I can't explain that.
You know, the thing about the resurrected body is we know from the gospel accounts that, you know, at first they didn't recognize Jesus, right? They didn't recognize him. So there is something about the resurrected body that, you know, go back to your senses of history. As they're writing about this, they're trying to explain this. And it's, you know, the resurrection's a one-off event. It's never happened before. It's never happened since, right? This is a one-off event, and they're trying to explain it. I have a hard time believing, and this is just my own personal theology, but I think there's enough there. I have a hard time believing a loving God would not have us know each other.
Well, I don't know that that's material because it seems to me that the purpose of the resurrection and our participation in it is to worship before God to eternity. And if that is the case, then relationships would not make any difference.
Well, my only argument to that then was, what are we doing at church then? What is the church?
We're preparing for the time when we will worship God in eternity.
But we're called to relationship too.
We are, and therein lies the tension. I mean,
Yeah.
many, well, I shouldn't say many, there are those who fixate on being reunited with loved ones in death and in eternity. That might not be. And you won't care. Too busy worshiping.
Well, heaven is nothing if it's not a place of bliss, right? Food for thought. As I said, there's a lot of tributaries that the resurrection leads you down, no doubt about it.
Say, Mark, at that time, what was the Jewish belief of the afterlife?
Yeah, and we'll get to that next week, but the Jewish belief is going to be, it's tied with creation. Yes, there's going to be a resurrection, and it's going to be tied to judgment. The belief was the judgment of God, and then so we'll be raised and God will judge us. That was a big part of it. And then as it develops, the belief that, again, God is creator. God is creator, and that's his nature, his business is creating. And so they were anticipating, without knowing yet, of course, the Christian narrative, but they were anticipating a resurrection of judgment where people would then be justly rewarded or punished. Does that answer your question? That's the kind of the best. Next week when we get to that, we'll sort of develop that more fully. Any other thoughts? 2/3 of Americans who claim to believe in the resurrection, when polled, said they do not believe they will have physical bodies after the resurrection, but will be disembodied spirits. And again, that's just a little taste of Plato's influence on Christianity. And again, the arguments, the argumentation, the debate that goes on, what is the nature of our resurrection? Now, conclusions about death from the ancient pagan world. Who are the dead? Well, according to the ancients, the pagans, they were once embodied humans, of course, but now they're souls or shades, maybe. A good portion believed you're just dead and that's it. Where were they? Well, most likely in a place the Greeks described as Hades, maybe hanging around their tombs, but mostly just dead. Just ceased to exist. What was wrong? Well, nothing. For a good Platonist, the soul was glad to be rid of the body. Okay, so there was nothing wrong with dying. There's nothing wrong with death. It was just the natural course of things. But according to Plato, your soul would then exit your body and go off to live some better existence. Now, what was the solution? And this is where Christianity, of course, has a powerful message. The solution is there was no solution in the ancient world to death. Death was all powerful.
They didn't probably think it was a problem that needed to be solved.
And not only it didn't need to be solved, but they couldn't do anything about it.
Right.
Kind of a double-edged sword. So there was no solution. Death was all powerful. Okay, so that's the ancient world that this event of the resurrection and this Christian belief is going to develop. And again, as you can see from this, the idea that you're going to start a religion and resurrection is going to be the centerpiece of it. If you're designing a religion, that's the road you don't want to go down. You're not going to get anybody to believe it. The concept of resurrection was rejected. Anastasis, rejected. Now, in conclusion here, I'll leave you with the words of N.T. Wright about our session for today. N.T. Wright says, "The road to the underworld ran only one way. From its Bible of Homer and Plato, through its practices, beliefs, symbols, and grand theories, we can trace a good deal of variety about the road to Hades and what one might find upon arrival. As with all one-way streets, there is bound to be someone who attempts to drive in the opposite direction." And those are those exceptions, right, to the rule. But the road was well policed. Would-be violators were turned back or punished. And even they only occurred in what everybody knew to be myth. I highlighted that. Even these thoughts about life after death, other than Plato in the mystery religions and some of this other belief, most of the idea that there was life after death, that was storytelling. That was mythical. It was not based in any historical event. There wasn't something you could point to like the resurrection and say, hey, something happened here. Okay.
Isn't it kind of interesting that they believed in Hades, but they didn't have the opposite of Hades?
Yeah.
Why would they believe in Hades and not believe in another road?
Yeah, and that's that Greek sort of mythological idea that you had to have something, when you died, there had to be some sort of final punctuation mark to your existence. I think that's the best way I can describe it. And they described it as Hades, or another word they used was Tartarus.
There were good parts in Hades.
And it wasn't a bad...
That was just where the dead were. It's not,
Yeah.
It's not hell.
You're right.
In our feelings of hell.
Right.
We have in mind. There were good parts in Hades. It was just the afterworld.
Yeah, thank you, Shelby, for that. Yeah, that's absolutely right. That Hades, it wasn't, go back to the previous slide, it wasn't looked upon as something akin to like our concept of hell, where there's eternal damnation and torment. It was just where you ended up. So, in wrapping up, I hope you get a sense now of the ancient pagan world. What was the average person thinking in Greece or in Rome about this topic? Next week we'll come back and we'll get into the biblical record. We'll look at the Old Testament. We'll look at the thinking there that was starting to develop about life after death and resurrection. I hope you found this useful. This is, again, a topic that I feel, I'm glad I'm doing it, but I feel, a little, what's the word? I'm not the expert. I'm not the expert, but I'm trying to shed some light on it for your edification. So, in that sense, again, I hope you found it useful. Fill out the cards if you have any questions at all that you want in the future to be answered. I'll try to do it. Canon Seeger, you'll have me running now to my books and trying to find some more defense. But thank you all for coming, and hopefully we'll see you next week. God bless you. And again, leave your questions on the table. Thank you.